Hello and welcome to SharePoint 2010, Integration and Interoperability. What you need to know. Down in the bottom right hand corner, you'll see a Twitter tag for my name as well as the hashtag for the conference. So feel free to follow along as we go through this. Who am I? My name is Richard Harbridge. I work for a company called All In Consulting in Massachusetts. We do a lot of SharePoint work. I love SharePoint. In fact, I've been working with it for about 6 or 7 years now, and I've worked from an administrator, developer perspective, IT pro, project manager, business analyst. My experiences are pretty broad, and through all that, one of the things that I have touched on in multiple cases from multiple points of view has been integration projects revolving around SharePoint 2007, sometimes using the BDC, which we'll be talking about a little bit, and of course SharePoint 2010 and the BCS and the integrated capabilities therein. So our goal today is to sort of take this idea of maybe you're a bit confused about what SharePoint 2010's features are, why we might want to use it, when we should use it, and those types of things, and create some confidence and clarity around, yes, it is a powerful platform, there's lots of benefits in using it, and there's also some times when you probably shouldn't use it. What we're going to be talking about is business data challenges, SharePoint's important interoperability and a platform approach to it, what the BCS is, and we're going to do a demonstration. In that demonstration, we're going to use SharePoint Designer as well as UI. We won't be opening up Visual Studio for those people who are really hankering to see some complex code. Again, perhaps in a different session. We will also hopefully get to limitations of the BCS as a bonus section, and that'll give you a bit more context going forward. So, the first thing we want to start with is the challenges around business data inside of SharePoint and all enterprise systems, because SharePoint, of course, is just like any other enterprise. And before I sort of start this, I just want to bring up the point that in the next year, in 2011, it's expected that business integration and the fact that we have all these disparate systems and we need to connect them is going to be pretty much the fundamental focus for IT. And I believe that, and I know that there's quite a few different articles and studies that say the same thing. So hopefully this kind of resonates with you today as being something that's sort of on point, with the interests of your field. Business data is in every enterprise, right? We have examples here of customer, supplier, quality, operations, and financial data. The data is on different systems, right? So we might have some data, in a system together. Sometimes we might have that data on a similar framework or a similar platform or a similar operating system and all those types of scenarios, but perhaps on different data sets, right, and different ways of accessing that data. We have different interfaces, right? So beyond like the API level and that sort of thing, we have actual GUIs and ways to interact with that data that are different, right? And sometimes we might have one interface for multiple systems, sometimes we might have one interface for multiple databases or collections of data, and then sometimes we might just have a one-on-one relationship and so on and so forth. It's pretty varied in most organizations. We have a content within those databases. We have contact information, as an example, in our customer database, in our supplier database, and in our financial database. The next thing we have is IT is working to keep all of these different sets of business data or databases in the organization running effectively, right? And coordinating and managing all that information. And from the other side, if we look at the bottom, the users are coming at it and they're using that business data to improve business processes, to improve return in the business. Well, there's some challenges that result from all of these different things. The first one is that there's high integration costs, often custom and one-off scenarios where IT creates integration between two systems, but that's sort of like a one-off scenario. It's completely custom. We're looking at, okay, we want to connect customers and suppliers, so we connect it in certain ways, and then what we do is that person who connected it wrote all that code, a year later is no longer there, or 2 years later, or 3 years later, and then that becomes a legacy project because it was never updated. And so now we have to deal with that, bringing stuff away from it, and so on and so forth. There's also the fact that there's very high overhead. Obviously, if IT's got to manage each system independently, and each system has its own security, its own maintenance, from a disaster recovery scenario, they all have different ones, right? There's a lot of IT overhead involved in different systems, right? So that's why we want to potentially have unified framework or unified systems, which is pretty rare, but does happen. And keeping that in mind, there's other challenges from the user side. There's high dissatisfaction. If I'm a user and I have to use multiple interfaces and they're very different, that can be very confusing. That can be very frustrating for me as an end user, and it leads to higher training costs as well. If we take like SharePoint as an example in this middle one, that interface SharePoint really is a very powerful and robust interface for users. And when you think of it that way, it's a very, very broad and deep interface. There's a lot to learn about it. And if we take another parallel system or something on par in terms of the enterprise space, and you have multiple versions of those, it becomes extraordinarily costly for your users to learn each of those systems, and certainly to learn them effectively. And the biggest point with all of this is that redundant data and processes are all over the place. I gave the example of contacts, right? So here I have contacts where I have customer contacts, supplier contacts, and financial or billing contacts. Well, as an end user, so looking at it from this lower end of end users, I have high dissatisfaction because I have to actually input my customer data into this first interface, which goes to maybe customers and suppliers, but then I have to input similar data into the financials so that we can bill that customer, right? Or so there's some duplication and there's extra processes that are redundant and unnecessary if we just had better integration or more effective enterprise strategy and so on and so forth. So this is really, really a big deal in organizations, and in some cases it's becoming a little bit worse when we start thinking in software as a service models and other things where people are kind of working around sort of the IT hierarchy and building up their own little silos of data and bringing that all together. So it's becoming it's a very like I said earlier, it's certainly on a lot of people's minds as something, how do we solve this? How do we tackle this with maybe existing purchases and investments in technology like SharePoint, or in new technologies that work well with the current ones that we've already invested in. So just another way of looking at those challenges with business data might be how it impacts. Right, so these are the things that I mentioned in different contexts, right? Multiple places to search, administer and manage content, multiple places to secure information. But each of these things, while they might have a direct impact on, say, IT for higher overhead to service user requests, there's an indirect impact that if we have higher overhead to service user requests, we can't service as many user requests. So the end users have an impact from that as well, and that they're not getting as many of their requests serviced in a timely manner, right? And for all of these, they have variations of that impact. So this is what I'm trying to highlight with this graph. So the big thing that I'm pointing out here, and I feel like everyone hopefully is on the same page with this, is that there are challenges that disparate and disconnected business data systems cause, right? And we're all aware of that. So what do we watch out for? What's the thing that to be careful of here? It's that no system, product, or application, or platform, SharePoint included, can completely solve business data challenges. And the real fundamental reason for that is because often it's not a technology issue, it's a process issue, it's a people issue, right? If people are able to spin up their own silos of data, and the process is not checking for that, clarifying that, or directing them to the appropriate place, or making sure that people are aware of it and consulted on it, etc., you're going to have issues. There's times where people become a big issue because there's change management and other types of strategies that are very difficult at times to enact adequately. So this is a really, really big deal, and something to keep in mind as we go forward, because we're really going to be focusing on this orange wheel of technology for the rest of the discussion today, but there is a lot more behind the scenes here. So SharePoint's important interoperability. What the heck is interoperability? And how does it apply to SharePoint? Why does it even matter? Well, interoperability is the ability of a system to work with other systems without special effort. Why this is important when you think about it, this is more of a utopia thing. It's not really existing right now. It's really hard to picture a system that works with other systems without special effort. But if you think about it, if something's not building towards an interoperable future, right? If we know that it's not, adhering to standards, if it's not doing things like that, we know that we don't want to invest in it, right? If we spend time and energy building something into a platform that's siloed and is going to become legacy and not going to be compliant with standards and new technologies, then really kind of we're wasting our money, because in a couple of years when the business needs to change its processes or start to leverage new technology, it won't be able to, because we're sort of pigeonholed, if you will, in one technology subset. So interoperability is key. How do we achieve it? Two ways. I mentioned one, we adhere to published interface standards, and the second way is by making use of a broker of services that can convert one system's interface into another on the fly, right? So these are the two ways we achieve interoperability, and I'm going to try and explain why and how SharePoint does these things. So I'm going to explain it by using this platform approach. First, I'll start with the UI, right? Is SharePoint a UI platform? When we start talking about interoperability, what's interoperable about the UI part? Well, why would we use SharePoint as a user interface platform is a good question to ask. If I'm a developer, why would I build my solution in SharePoint with the SharePoint interface rather than just build custom interface as an example? Well, because we have consistent user experience across browsers. SharePoint is standards compliant, more or less, right? Almost for some of the new browsers, but it does work across all the browsers. So, knowing that's going to significantly reduce the time it takes you to develop and test and brand and so on and so forth a separate interface if you can already leverage what SharePoint's done and just build on top of that, or, if it's good enough the way it is, leverage what's there. So it is a UI platform, and those HTML standards are adhering to published interface standards, right? From this point onwards, in this new release of SharePoint 2010, it's now going to adhere to HTML standards, and the next one is going to be even more standard compliant. So it's really important to know that, hey, it's worth the investment as a business to build integration type scenarios, or at least interface different systems in SharePoint, because it's going to be interoperable in the future, but also it's going to save time from a development perspective and those types of things. There's also this bonus. It also has the ability to work in Office. And what I mean by that is you can leverage things like Outlook or document information panels in Word and things like that with a lot of the integration features of SharePoint. Right? So it's like a UI platform in that not only are you using the web interface, but in some cases you can use these client interfaces that people are already familiar with to update data and work with data across your enterprise. So that's the two reasons I believe it's a UI platform. Let's talk about whether or not it's an identity platform. Why would we use SharePoint as an identity platform, and how? How could that even be possible? Because it was very, very difficult in SharePoint 2007 to do that, right? Authentication was a really tricky thing when we started to get into integration scenarios. Well, Claims is awesome, and Claims is the sort of solution for a lot of the problems we had in 2007 when we started to integrate with a lot of different systems that had different authentication mechanisms. And that the best way I could describe this, rather than kind of walk through this complex diagram, is if I go to the airport, I'm a Canadian citizen with a TN visa in the United States. When I go to the airport and I walk in through the front desk and I get my little ticket for my plane, security checks it and they compare the ticket and they compare my passport. They don't call up Canada and say, excuse me, is Richard Harbridge who he says he is, and so on and so forth. They don't have to, because they trust the provider, which is the Canadian government in this case, to provide appropriate identification, and they trust their ticket system to give extra information on top of that, such as which gate should I be going to, and so on and so forth, to make sure everything's syncing up. Of course, once they've authenticated me, right, once they let me through security, the people at each of those ticket counters, right, before I jump on the plane, are going to also check and validate that my ticket's the correct one, right? So again, if you think of it from a SharePoint perspective, that authentication piece is getting into the SharePoint realm of our interface, and then which areas I have access to is again sort of defined by the same way that ticket, which has information about my flight and those types of things. We have similar information that we would abstract from the provider. So that's the idea of claims. And why it's important is because it allows us to connect with these third-party or back-end or external, internal, etc. data systems that don't necessarily use Windows authentication, right, or Windows integrated authentication, right? And then it becomes really key because many systems don't. And so that is one of those challenges that we can use Claims to supersede. Claims does adhere to published interface standards, so it's another thing to point out, right? One more of those interface standards pieces. And so this is important because Claims, in my opinion, makes this an identity platform, right? It allows us to use SharePoint from an integration perspective and have a consistent way of managing identities throughout the process. Next is search. Is it a search platform? Right? Why would we use SharePoint as a search platform, especially when we start talking about these other data systems? Well, we can query third-party search engines using SharePoint UI, right? So we could potentially look at other data systems in SharePoint. Another thing to point out is that SharePoint has the ability to crawl multiple types of content, right? Websites, file shares, public folders, those types of things as well. So that gives us some added functionality around federating queries, if you will, to multiple search systems, right? That's a pretty broad sense, right? We can federate queries to multiple search systems. We can query third-party search engines using the SharePoint UI. We could potentially have other UIs querying the SharePoint search engine, right? And so, vice versa. So it gets really interesting, right? So SharePoint is a very interoperable search platform. And what does all of these things, right? And I kind of touched on it, but it's a 3-letter word, and it's highlighted there with underlines inside of it, and it's not WSS, it's the BCS. So what indexes databases, web services, or custom repositories, and so on and so forth? Well, it's the BCS. So the BCS, or the Business Connectivity Services, which I'm going to talk about for a lot of the rest of the session, is the thing that allows us to index a range of content repositories as well. So from a search perspective, we're able to use that. Earlier in this previous slide says line of business data. Well, the line of business data in this example might be using the BCS to connect to. So that's important to understand. And that index of that data could be in web services and so on and so forth. So really we have kind of an unlimited amount of sources that we can index. So that's how the search works. There's also a bonus in search in that it has open search. Remember that publish interface standards? Well, that's one of them, right? Open search is a standard. And what we've done is, or what SharePoint now does, is it has an ability to use this open search. And I'll give 2 examples where I've seen it used effectively in an enterprise. One, they had an acronym wiki. So when you did a search in the acronym wiki, it would return the internal results first, right? Those were the higher ranked results. But when your search asked for something that wasn't already recorded in that wiki with links to the organization and the people and the context and things like that, and then what they did was they used OpenSearch and they federated it to that, so you'd still get some results. You'd never get no results when you did a search for an acronym. And that was really, really useful for the business, because then it would highlight because again, remember, they're recording this, so they could see what are the things that people searched for that they don't have wiki articles internally about, should they build them, and so on and so forth. This was very important to the organization around getting commonality in language and standards, because they were trying to implement standards in a manufacturing sense. Another example I have is an organization that used Flickr, and they used an image engine sort of search where they had images inside of SharePoint, they had images in a file share, and they had images in Flickr that they used. So what they did is, if you couldn't find the images in SharePoint, which is the #1 resource, then you'd be looking at the file share as sort of the second part, and then finally, if you couldn't find images in those 2 places, it would go out to Flickr and give you more images. So you were pretty much guaranteed to find what you were looking for. So, it is a search platform, and it has interoperability for certain. Is it a data access platform? Well, everyone gets that SharePoint does a great job of accessing SharePoint content. But what about external systems and content, right? What about those things? Does it do a good job with that? Well, the BCS is the answer to that. BCS allows us to access external systems and content in association with claim and things like that, so we can get access to it. But there's also these 2 bonuses I want to highlight, because remember, we were talking about standards, right? So CMIS and REST are 2 other data access standards that I want to mention. So CMIS is Content Management Interoperability Services, which is basically a platform that allows you to build against multiple technologies without knowing anything really about how the APIs work. If you know CMIS, you'll be able to work with those. It's just important from a discovery perspective, or in the future when we start to have all these systems in your enterprise, we need to have that level of interoperability so we can build common interfaces, search systems, and things like that that will work across all of those systems. Microsoft has been implementing this from both a client and provider perspective. Right? So not only on the SharePoint server side, but also in other contexts. So it's not available in the box, but it is available via SharePoint Admin Toolkit, which has other features as well. So if you just download that and implement that, you'll now have ability to start to use CMIS with SharePoint 2010. So some other examples, right? If I have Alfresco or Drupal or certain other systems, there might be ways that we could use CMIS and SharePoint together, right? There might not be. It really depends on where things stand. An example of a current functioning program that uses CMIS would be the CMIS Explorer, which actually allows you to crawl, or not even crawl, discover and search through different systems, right? Very, very cool way of working through a lot of different things from SharePoint to other technologies. And then there's REST, right? REST is more of a development-focused thing, but it's certainly a standard way of accessing data. And so I won't get all the way into it, but certainly, if you're aware of what REST is, awesome. If you're not, you should definitely look into it because, again, SharePoint 2010 supports REST, which is a really important change and feature. Some might say it has storage interoperability, right? Some people say RBS is sort of the start to more storage interoperability. I don't know if I would really go that far. From an external data perspective, I think BCS is the coolest part, and I mentioned it a lot. Business Connectivity Services, that's a new or an improved thing in SharePoint 2010. And really, the one thing I didn't mention was that number 2. By making use of a broker of services, right? So that, I believe, is actually what BCS does. BCS, in my opinion, is really that broker of services that converts one system's interface into another's on the fly. And there's a limitation of that, of course, right? There's times where you need something more robust, and you might go to BizTalk or some other, more powerful integration system. But there's certain times where that broker of services needs to be something very, very simple, and BCS can do that, right? If we're not talking about very, high transactional based approaches. So SharePoint is a growing interoperable UI identity search and data access platform. And what we got to watch out for, through all of this, right? It looked like this perfect story. It's interoperable, right? It's got all these new features, and it's certainly way better than it was in 2007. But the reality is there's still special effort that's required, right? In all of these scenarios, it's sort of a start, but it's certainly not, at the level that we would love to have it at, right? So we have to keep that in mind that, yes, it's interoperable. Yes, it's a good investment for those reasons that I've mentioned. Yes, it's probably the right thing to leverage in many situations, but it's going to take special effort, so we need to be cognizant of that when we estimate for it or when we start to figure out which projects should be associated with SharePoint, which ones should be associated with other methodologies that are out there. So what is the BCS, right? Well, we could look at this diagram and we could try and describe it that way. Or we could look at the simplified one. This one that looks really complicated but actually makes a lot of sense. Or we could use the simplified one. We're going to use the simplified one for today, and hopefully you'll find this helpful. In order for us to access external data, we have to use something called external content types. External content types are basically the root of how the BCS and Business Connectivity Services work in SharePoint 2010. It describes the structure of the external system, sort of like the fields, the methods, and the connection for that data. If you're familiar with SharePoint 2007, the application definition files are really now external content types. External content types, of course, have a little bit more functionality than sort of the old application definition files, but it is, again, a similar construct. If you're not familiar with either of those, think of it as types of content that are external. And what we're doing is we're defining different connections. Really, another way of looking at it is it's a filtered connection to that other data, and we're going to leverage it in different ways. Another piece that I want to point out here is that it also describes how the data behaves within SharePoint and Office. When I say Office, if it's declared as, say, a task or a contact or an event / calendar type a piece of data, then it's going to behave inside of Office, such as Outlook, in different ways, right? It's going to look and function like a contact in Outlook, or it's going to look and function like an event in Outlook. It's managed and reused from a central location. So all external content types can be managed and reused from this one place. That's really helpful because it's not site collection specific or anything like that. Whereas in SharePoint 2007, if you remember, content types were site collection specific. Unless you used custom code, it was very difficult to have a common, say, metadata strategy for the organization or things like that. In SharePoint 2010, there's a thing called the Managed Metadata Service, and there's a thing called the Content Type Hub, which allows site collections to subscribe to the Content Type Hub and to use those. And the idea of that, the benefit of that, is that we can use content types everywhere once we've defined them once. This is the same idea of what external content types in their central location provides in terms of a benefit. We put them in one place, we create them in one place, and now we can potentially leverage them wherever we want. Again, from a managed security perspective, we can also define which ones we don't want to be shared everywhere, and so on and so forth. the next thing I want to point out is that you add it through SharePoint Designer 2010 or Visual Studio 2010, or you can import directly to it. So how do we use external content types? I get it. So that's the structural piece that's really key, and I understand that that's what I have to use, but how do we use it inside of SharePoint? Well, there's sort of two ways right off the bat, right? There's external lists and there's external data columns. Let's talk about external lists. External lists allow us to basically expose, just like a SharePoint list in terms of UI and familiarity, but it has, it's actually external data shown in SharePoint, right? So it's sort of surfaced in SharePoint. It gives us this full CRUD capability, right? It actually gives us those little new forms and those little edit forms and so on and so forth. And those are, if you define the operations, will be tied directly to backend data. So when I click my save button on my edit form, it's going to update the SQL backend if that's what we're connecting to, or it might pass it through the web service to something else. So it has that familiar UI navigation. You have sorting, you have filtering, you have grouping. You know, it's actually an SP list object in the object model if that's how you want to access it and work with it. Like I said, the forms are there. You can upsize them to InfoPath if you want to do things like, you know, validation, or you want to put some code in there and do some fancy stuff. And then of course they can be taken offline, right? So what do I mean by offline? It's a new idea, right? Taking business data offline. So what it basically is that we can download business data to a SharePoint workspace as lists or Word document libraries with external data columns, right? So in SharePoint workspace, we can basically take that information, go on a plane, make changes to it, and then once we get back to an office or an internet connection, resync it, and it'll update potentially the back-end data systems through web services or direct connections. We also have the ability to take a lot of that content into Outlook, especially contacts, tasks, calendars, and posts. Right? And I'm going to be going through an example of contacts when we get into the demonstration and how you bring that into Outlook, and it works very similarly in that I can take it offline and do things like that. We can also use it in Office applications and of course search. So external content types can be used in Word, right, in the document information panel, and then that could potentially populate the rest of the document, so it's valuable in that context. We also have the ability to use it in Access, and that one's pretty obvious. And for InfoPath, we can do it, a lot of ways. We could have a drop-down that's rendered from external content type, and the content therein, or we can do lots of other creative ways of leveraging external data in InfoPath forms. We can also use code, and it's not that complicated to do it, but certainly you can if you want to with Visual Studio and VSTO, in Visio, Excel, OneNote, and so on and so forth. Remember that a lot of these programs or applications like Excel and Visio as an example can actually access external data in their own ways. This is just one more way that's more structured by using external content types if you choose to define it that way. Then there's also search results, right? So I brought up the idea of data column and I didn't really explain that. So the external data column could be associated with a lot of different documents inside our organization. So we have all this content in our portal, and maybe we have our products or other listings located in some database. So we want to connect those. We want to basically add context and relevance to the material that we have in the portal by associating it with some of that external content, like which product is this document associated with, right? And that's the example I'll be going through. There's also a bonus, because I love bonuses, and that web parts also exist. There's 5 web parts that existed in SharePoint 2007, and they still exist in SharePoint 2010. And then, of course, there's the chart web part, which is new, and it allows us to connect to data and render it in charts. Okay, what about those 5 web parts? Didn't those work with the BDC or in SharePoint 2007? For those who are really keeners and have done this, they do work. The only difference is that now they have read-write capability. They're claims aware, which is really important. As I said, not everything uses Windows authentication. They have batch and bulk operational support, which is very, very cool. BDC is actually still used, if you're curious, for search indexing and things like that, in that it also has new features like incremental crawl and item level security, right? Those are really, really important and awesome new features when we start talking about search and indexing connectors. Remember that earlier I talked about how the BCS can be used as a search platform, or the BDC, if you will, can also add that value, right? Remember we call it line of business data was the option. They added basically the ability to take it into clients and server, so we can, like I said, in Outlook or Workspace or something else if you wanted to. And again, from a cache perspective, it's more effective, and it creates, this is pretty self-explanatory, I think, on that one. So how do I actually build it out? So we talked about what this BCS is. Okay, it's got features, it's got like the external list thing, it's got ways that I can leverage it. Great. How do I actually use it, right? How do I make that work? Well, there's sort of three approaches or pieces to this. The first one is the out of the box, in that any user can go and, if they have access to that external data, create an external list that renders that data. You can connect those external lists or existing external lists to Outlook or SharePoint Workspace. We can create external data columns on any document library or any of our content in our organization and associate external data with that. Again, from a search relevancy and other reasons, that can be very, very beneficial from workflow, if you imagine that. We can also take some of those external lists, as an example, and upgrade the info path forms on them, right? Or we might want to, take the even the lists that, or document update panels. When we need to associate business data, we might want to upgrade those with different validation procedures and so on and so forth, or special business logic. From a workflow perspective, as I mentioned, for external data columns, it might make sense to have workflows trigger off and either move things around or go through different approval processes and so on and so forth. Right? And then lastly, we get the code base, right? So when you get to the really complex stuff where you can actually create reusable components, in that fourth bullet there, and you can actually use those again out of the box or customize them if they're like external content types, which is what ECT represents, if they're actions, UI parts and things like that we build. So it's pretty broad based. We have a really nice tool range from the simple out of the box UI all the way to the full Visual Studio with SDK and all sorts of other benefits. So what is the SharePoint Designer process, right? It's pretty straightforward. We discover our data source, we map our operations to that data source, and we connect to SharePoint and or Office. And that's basically it. And we're going to be going through this process, so I won't spend too much time on it. Once we've done that process, we might want to look at Visual Studio, right? We want to upsize our solutions that we created in SharePoint Designer, right? If we've created some, external content types in SharePoint Designer, maybe what we want to do is create more business logic and rules and things like that, or maybe we want to provision those to multiple farms or really complex scenarios, or we want to create connectivity packs, right? So we can aggregate data across multiple backend systems, right? Or perform special transformations on that data. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier the ability to take it into those Office clients, that VSTO add-ins, right? That's really valuable. So the BCS has a bunch of new capabilities bundled with some old enhanced BDC ones. So it's still a little bit of the old, but certainly a lot of new stuff on top of that, which really takes it to the next level in terms of scalability, in terms of organization, and certainly in terms of leverage, right? You can use it in a lot of ways that we couldn't before. And selecting the right tool is important, but practice makes perfect, right? So yeah, we could use SharePoint. We decide SharePoint's the way we want to go, but if you haven't used it, if you haven't used the BCS and you haven't understood its nuances, when you should use it, when you shouldn't, right, it becomes really tricky and dangerous. A lot of organizations might say, okay, I get it. I want to use the BCS, and I think it's going to reduce the the length of this project significantly. The problem is the first time you use it, it's probably actually going to keep the project length the same, if not more, because you have to learn a tremendous amount about the BCS and how it works and how it functions and so on and so forth, and of course how to set it up right and how to leverage it correctly. And after that, every project's going to be faster, right? So you have to keep that in mind as well. A lot of people might burn themselves on the first project they do with BCS, and that they might overestimate what the tool really does. Remember, it's an interface tool more than I would say it's an integration tool, and I'll come back to that. That was a lot of information, right? A lot of people are probably thinking, whoa, that's a ton of stuff we just covered. So before you run away and think, okay, I'm never coming back, I'm never attending another session by Richard again, let's all take a breather and take a look at this cute little kitten. Hopefully at this point we're all relaxed, and what we'll do is we'll do a demonstration of how all of this works. That's right, we'll get right into the nitty-gritty of how all this comes together. So to start off, what I want to do is I'm actually going to go to Central Administration, and in Central Administration I'm going to click on Manage Service Applications. So this is all of the service applications that I have configured for my SharePoint 2007 farm. In these, I have a thing called the Business Data Connectivity Service, or BCS for short. This is the thing we've been talking about this whole time. We also have something else which I won't go into, which is a service called Secure Store Service. This is important for managing credentials and things of that nature, when you start to work for connecting to external systems. For the service that we're going to be talking about, the Business Data Connectivity Service, we can manage it, we can set administrators for it, and we can do this thing called publishing. In SharePoint 2007, one of the issues with the BDC was that the shared service provider had the BDC in it, but it also had the user profiles, it had the search, it had Excel services, right? They were all in this one single shared service provider. So in SharePoint 2010, architecturally they made improvements by making each of those services separate, rather than in this one shared service instantiation. And that's important because it allows us to do things like publish the service and use it in different scenarios across farms potentially and things like that. So here I'm going to go into my Business Data Connectivity Service. This is the same thing as managing it. Inside of my Business Data Connectivity Service, I have a series of external content types. If you remember, I said that we have a central location where all external content types are stored. This is one way of viewing that data. Right? So here I have an external content type, and I can do things with it from a IT pro or administrator perspective. I can set the permissions of this external content type. This is important because it allows me to create a level of abstraction and security that says, okay, certain people can execute or select this in clients and so on and so forth. It's useful because it gives us that extra layer beyond what potentially could happen if we were doing a pass-through scenario and we did, the authentication and calculation of like who should have permissions to what and so on and so forth by using the credentials in a web service. Or if we went for whatever reason directly to the SQL backend, this is giving us one extra layer of permissions to make sure that not everyone can use this connection, right? Because this is a filtered connection to backend data. So that is important to point out, that it has that level of permissions. At this point, what we'll do is we'll minimize the central administration, and we're going to talk about, from an end user perspective, how this all comes together. So the first thing we're going to talk about is external lists. So here I'm going to click on Contoso Inventory on the left-hand side. This is going to take me to the Contoso Inventory list. When I clicked on that, I'll do it again, you can see that little green icon in the middle there. That's actually retrieving the data, right? It's using that read list operation that we're going to define in a little bit, and it's actually retrieving the data from the back-end system, in this case from SQL. So we're pulling up this inventory information from SQL and rendering it in SharePoint. You'll notice that the external list does look and function just like a SharePoint list. I have the ability to edit items as an example because we have that CRUD, right? Create, read, update, and delete. If I was to edit this to say, hey, we have more quantity on hand, we now have 20 items, I can click save. And what that's doing is it's actually, again, performing an operation that's saving that data back into the SQL and then rendering it on our SharePoint external list. This does function very similarly to an external list in that I can, filter different columns, I can sort things, and so on and so forth. So that's what an external list is. And we're going to come back to that in an example a little bit later where we do contacts. Here we have a series of documents in SharePoint. Pretty common scenario, right? Well, one of the things when we start working with documents is we might want to associate metadata with that document, right? So here we have an example where that metadata isn't something that we store in SharePoint, right? Our listing of products is actually something that's stored in a SQL database or it's in some other system. And so what we want to do is we want to still use that, right? We want to connect to that external data set, and we want to use that and leverage that in SharePoint to add further context to our documents and our material in our site. So here I have a camera, I have a product camera or a category of digital cameras, and I have a product key. If I choose to edit the properties of this item, which I will, and I remove this and instead make it, say, a accessory like a carrying case. So let's pretend that this document relates to a carrying case. So here we have a pink carrying case, perfect. Say OK here, and I'll say save. What this is doing is it's updating, this metadata column or this external data column that I've defined so that it says Contoso carrying case. Great, big deal. Well, what it also does is it defines other or infers other pieces of metadata based on the field, such as the product category, which is now accessories, not digital camera, and as well as the product key, right? Why this is useful is because when we start to get into search scenarios, it's very, very valuable. Here I did a search for camera, I get 169 results. I need to be able to refine that. I need to find the actual material and content that I wanted. So on the left-hand side here, these are called facets, right? There's a SharePoint 2007 Codeplex project for this, but in SharePoint 2010, they're natively in there. The only thing different here is I have fast, so I'm seeing some numbers and a bunch of other stuff. So here I can choose my product category. Product category, again, is an external field, right? So we're looking at external metadata, and we're basically filtering on cameras and camcorders when I do the search. So instead of 169 results, now I'm seeing 17 results. So there's only 17 results that relate to the product category. You can see it in the query string here, the product category of cameras, right? And if I scroll down, not only do I have product category, but I have subsets of that, right? So after I've identified the product category, I can also identify the specific product and see all the items that relate to that product. So here now I have 12 items that relate to that product that have the word camera in them. And if I wanted to click on one of these as an example, it's not just documents, but it's potentially things like document sets, which is a new thing in SharePoint 2010. So here I have a product category, again, that's associated with it. Remember, I looked at accessories and things like that. I also have the actual product. This is the product I searched for. And you can also see the product is associated with these documents, and that's why in many cases the documents and the document set are being displayed. So a very, very powerful feature that's all the way through SharePoint, not just at the sort of surface level. The next thing I want to do is we're actually going to go into SharePoint Designer, and we're going to create our own external content type. So to do that, I'm going to click New External Content Type inside of SharePoint Designer 2010's External Content Type section. So here's like a typical home page inside of your SharePoint 2010 Designer. I'm going to click on External Content Types. I'm going to click on New External Content Type. It retrieves information from the server. I'm going to choose a name. This name is important because it's how I'm going to refer to this from this point onwards. So I'm going to use Richard, and we'll call it SharePoint Live Demonstration. It's like nice full names. And we're going to use the namespace of SharePoint's fine. We'll call it Richard, and then we'll call it Live. And we can assign an office item type. This is useful if we're using appointments, contacts, tasks, or posts. So earlier I mentioned that you can bring some of this content potentially into, say, Outlook, and you can modify it in Outlook. Well, if we don't want it to, look like a generic list inside of Outlook, if we want it to behave like a contact, or if we want it to behave like a task, we can do that by inferring that it's related to that office type, and then in the, the follow-up steps, map certain properties to office properties. So here's my SQL backend, and it's actually the example I'm going to use is contacts example. So I'm going to actually use contacts. So the office item type I want to choose in this case is actually contact. And I could choose whether or not it's going to be enabled for offline sync. I'm going to keep enabled because I want to show an example where I'm going to show how we can take it in Outlook and kind of take that offline, if you will. I'm going to click here to connect to external content types. First step would be to add a connection, and I would walk through this process. It's pretty straightforward. I would create a SQL Server connection, or a web service connection, or potentially a .NET connection, right? If we we're doing certain processing and stuff like that, and I want to have there's lots of reasons we want to choose a .NET connection over a WCF one. Inside my list here, I have my database. This is the one I want. This is my contacts database. If I right-click on this, I have a number of options that are available to me. The one that matters for our example today is create all operations. This is going to create CRUD, right? Create, read, update, delete. And it's not just read in the single item, but it's also read list, right? So I'm going to click that, and what it does is it opens up this wizard. And this wizard's first pane is basically telling me what am I doing? Which operations am I creating? I'm creating all of them. That's perfect. So I'll click next. In the next page, what we're doing is we're actually mapping the parameters. So these are the fields in that database table for our example, and how do they map to SharePoint, or more importantly, the office type that we're inheriting from. So I'm going to say that the contact ID is the identifier. I'm going to choose email address as an example, and I'm going to say the office property in this case is actually going to be email address, right? So now what I've done is I've taken email address and I've assigned it to the office property. This office property is from that contacts, right? So the only types of fields we're going to see, as an example for last name, are those that relate to contacts, right? We're not going to see things that relate to events, start, end date, things like that, because this isn't an event. This is based off of a contact. That's what we inferred at the very beginning there. And just to show a different example here, the other ones were system strings. Here I have a system date time, and you can see that I have a smaller subset of options. And this is useful to know. So I could go through each of these, right? I could spend all our time right now going and setting up every single field. And typically what I would do is I'd map all these fields, but you don't need to see all that. Instead, I'm just going to quickly assign things like which fields need to show in the picker being how I actually select this on external data columns and things of that nature. So I'll pick the last name, first name, and the email address. And I'm going to click Next. The only message here is just saying with the ID, if we overwrite it, it's going to become a problem. That's okay. We only want to write an ID once. We're not going to change it after that. We do want in most normal circumstances, you're going to want to assign filter parameters, right? You don't want to retrieve everything. You can change the external list throttling and things like that, but is it a good idea? It depends on performance and a bunch of other considerations. So typically, because a database table can contain potentially millions of records and things like that, we want to make sure when that information comes to SharePoint, we're limiting it, right? We're creating filters. For this example, we're not going to, because I know how many records there are. And that's it. So all I did by finishing that was I created my CRUD, my create, read, update, and delete. I'm going to save this. This is my external content type that I'm saving. You can see that it's saving it to a common data store, right? Remember the BCS, or that service that we went into, shows me all of the different external content types I have. So I could just refresh external content types here, and I'll see the new external content type we created called SharePoint Richard Live as the namespace, and there's my external content type. I could go into central administration. So here in central administration, if I just reload my service application, I'm going to see the new external content type. This is important because I could assign permissions to it, right? Some of the things we might need to do is make sure that certain users have access to this before we say, oh, your external content type's created for you, go, right? Can they even access it? Those types of considerations need to be taken into account. So I'm going to cheat, and I'm just going to right click on this to create my external list. Remember, external list was that way we interacted with this in SharePoint. I could do a number of other options, like exporting the BDC model and then importing it in various circumstances. So my external list, this is inside of SharePoint Designer. I just need a name and a description. My external list name is going to be Richard's AdventureWorks Demonstration of Contacts. It's a really long name. It's not necessary to be long, but I'll use a long one. And what this is doing down in the bottom right here, you can see it's communicating with the web service, and it's basically provisioning this list, this external list, which is using this external content type, which is going to connect to that back-end data system and use that read list operation that we created in that wizard to actually render it inside of SharePoint. So, because I'm not a big fan of waiting around, let's actually go and see what this is going to look like. So I'm going to load up my intranet site. Inside my intranet site, because that's where I created it, we see Richard's AdventureWorks Demonstration of Contacts. I click on that. Here you can see all of the results. This is the same as what I see when I do my SQL query, right? If I change something in here, because we have full create, read, update, and delete, so if I go items, I choose to edit item, and I say, you know what, let's change Mr. Roberto's name to Mr. Roberto 123, and I click save, what's going to happen is that's actually going to save it into the SQL backend. So by clicking save there, we can see that we now see Mr. Roberto 123. If I go to the SQL side and I re-execute this query that I have, we can see it says Mr. Roberto 123, right? So we're seeing that the create, read, update, and delete relationships are potentially set up. The next thing I want to do is I want to show how this list, because we built it off of that Office contact type. So let me go back to the external list and just point this out again. When we created the external content type, right, here we have this external content type. Let's just edit it for a second to show what it looks like. We said it sort of inherits or uses the Office item type of contact. And if you remember, we mapped the fields to that contact type. So if I go back into my SharePoint environment, and I go to the list itself and I say connect this list to Outlook, Outlook is going to interpret this list not as a typical external list, but as a contact external list. Oh, we have an error here. Cannot install or update, and what it's basically saying is that I already have a process running, so this isn't the first time I've done this today. I'm going to just close my little Outlook connection client, and I reopen Outlook because for those who have watched a lot of IT shows, the secret solution to everything is turning it off and on again. So here I'm going to go to list again, and I'm just going to try that again, and this should work this time. And what it's going to do is it's going to connect to Outlook, and like I said before, it's going to show it as a contact list. You'll notice that it's actually adding, using the VSTO object, it's actually adding the list to Outlook, right? It's like sort of like an add-on. If I was to go to a contacts list, or we'll use the calendar list as an example here. If I go to this calendar list in SharePoint and I say, oh, you know what, this calendar, let's connect this to Outlook. This process of connecting this calendar to Outlook looks very different, right? It says, would you like to open basically this website? Yes, and when I do this, that's all the steps that are necessary to basically connect a calendar into SharePoint. Connect a SharePoint calendar into Outlook, right? For a little bit more advanced options like installing this external list or taking external data offline, we need to basically use this add-on procedure. And when I talked about the VSTO in terms of building on top of this stuff, that's what we were discussing. So here, since I already have Outlook open, what it's going to do is it's going to prompt up a little thing, or pop up a little prompt, and it's going to actually tell me how things are going, when it's going to actually add the external list, and so on and so forth. We can see that it's not showing up yet. So here it's saying preparing Outlook for external list. Great. We have our new external list. You'll see that it automatically populates here. This is all that external data brought into Outlook. If I was to disconnect right now from the internet and everything else, this data would be in this Outlook client, right? And I could take it on a plane, I could work with it, and so on and so forth. So let's go to Roberto, who we looked at earlier, and let's change his name back, right? Let's change it back to Roberto. And then let's just change his email address. Instead of my email address, we'll use a different email address I have, and we'll use that one. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Save, and this is again because remember I set the birth date, so we'll just say no to that. When I click Save, what ends up happening is that actually saves it to the SQL backend. So here I see SQL. If I re-execute this query, instead of being Mr. Roberto 123, it's going to say Mr. Roberto, and it changed the email address, right? So I can also update now from Office clients, and I can update from the actual SharePoint clients. So it's pretty powerful, right? From external lists we can work on this stuff, or from Office clients like Outlook we can work on external content. Very, very powerful, and that's what I really wanted to show in today's demonstration for this. So we'll minimize this and we'll move back to our slide deck. Okay, so that was our demo. You saw how BCS can be leveraged in SharePoint Designer and in SharePoint UI. And I want to kind of reiterate that point. You don't want to assume that the tools will significantly reduce the time it takes to integrate. It reduces the time it takes to interface. You kind of saw that those are surface level tools, right? There's not a lot behind them. Yes, if we get into code, there's lots of ways we can use the code, but the reality is it's really helping us interface or showcase that information to users so that they can interact with it. It's really not necessarily creating like transactional ways for us to manipulate massive data sets and things like that in the back end. So that's really important to understand and understand the differences. So I promised we would get into the bonus material around what the BCS limitations are if we had time. So we have a little tiny bit of time, so let's go through these as fast as possible. BCS limitations that you should be aware of is that there's no write support for blob or binary large objects, right? So if you were trying to write back that information through the BCS, it's basically not possible without using a stream accessor method in this workaround using the BCS data list. So keep that in mind. It is going to kind of bite you in the butt if you're trying to do things like writing back blobs. Your workflows can't be associated with external lists. In fact, you have to use basically the only way you can work with external data in SharePoint, out of the box with workflows is by using external data columns. So you have an external data column like the one we had in our document library, and we can associate and work with workflows in that way. But we can't, work with them directly on external lists. We can't use RSS feeds. We can't use REST feeds. We can't use, link for SB Metal stuff. We can't configure alerts for external lists. We can't export external list items to Excel or Visio diagrams and things like that. We can't use versioning for external lists, and that one kind of makes sense, right? When you think about it, you don't want to create this abstraction and extra content inside of SharePoint. You want the external list and external data to reside, where the actual data does reside, where it's stored. We don't want to create a duplication of that inside of SharePoint just so we can have some version history and stuff like that. So again, let the data source actually deal with that. From a data sheet perspective, you can't really do sort of that bulk update, but if you use XSLT, you can make your own, right? So that's also something to keep in mind. External lists also have no rating feature. Information policies can't be configured. Item level permissions can't be configured. Again, kind of going back to that version history example, it might not make sense having that extra layer of permission policies in SharePoint. That's a lot of extra performance and all sorts of other hits. No item or field validation unless you have info path, right? I talked about upsizing those info path forms. Lookups don't work on any column but ID. Big pain in the butt. No attachments. Again, no attachments might make sense because why would you do that? It's external list and external data as a result, so on and so forth. My biggest pet peeve personally is the external column has a limitation that you can't create a site column. You have to basically have it list based, right? So that external data column example where I had the product, that's list specific. List specific. I can't do it, without code and deploy it to multiple places. Just because I like to show quick examples of this stuff. If I go back to my list, this is that contacts list we made together. If I go to an item, you'll see that certain permissions or certain features are disabled. I can't modify item permissions. I can't modify version history or look at it. I can't use workflows. Again, if I go to the list options, a lot of things like RSS feed, export to Excel, the things that I mentioned, they're all grayed out. Some things behind the scenes are also disabled. So useful to know. These are the limitations of SharePoint BCS. Again, very quickly, and hopefully, if you don't get this, you can kind of look back at the recording of these presentations or some of the slide decks. So hopefully now you know more about the limitations of the BCS and will make fewer assumptions. Because a lot of people think that, a SharePoint external list works the same way as a SharePoint internal list. And they might rely on some of those features that I said aren't available, when you're doing your planning. So just keep that in mind. And, while I talked about these limitations, some of them make sense, so don't necessarily create workarounds for it. And I'll kind of get back at the end to how this all comes together. So what we talked about was that there are business data challenges, and those business data challenges in many cases are, at least assisted by using an interface like SharePoint. So the challenges aren't all technology challenges. That's the thing I want you to take away from this. When we get into integration projects, and I mentioned a couple times, there's often scenarios where it's not technology related that it creates a lot of complexity. SharePoint's important interoperability is important because it basically gives us a plethora of platform capabilities that's important for us to invest in. Right? We're not looking at this one-off solution like we normally do. We're looking at here's a platform, here's all the reasons we want to leverage a platform, and then taking that one step further, we know that SharePoint is interoperable and it's going to continue to be more interoperable in the future, so it's worth investing into. What is the BCS? It's basically a set of powerful connection capabilities. When we talk about external content types, we're really talking about structured types of external content. Right? So we're structuring things, whether it's a filtered connection and so on and so forth. External columns are really leveraging external content with internal content. So I'm basically adding metadata to my internal content that's based off of external content. I have external lists, which more or less interact like SharePoint lists. Very, very powerful, very cool. Extensibility and tooling wise, we can do everything from the UI to SharePoint Designer to Visual Studio 2010. You can create external lists in the UI, etc., right? Although I did create it from SharePoint Designer. Limitations of the BCS, basically, you know what? End goal, it's good enough and better than most options, and while I have little things that I'm not happy about, such as the fact that, the data column is, list specific, we can work around those. So as long as we're aware of them, it's easy to plan for them and kind of work around them. So thank you everyone for your time. At this point, I'm going to take the questions I can in the time remaining. Hope you've enjoyed this and you've gotten something out of it.